was 4 presentations, but Charlotte Brooks unfortunately couldn't be here due to a family emergency. So we have 3 presentations, which also means that our presenters can take a little more time if they want it. Did you guys get my email? Okay, so we're going to set the timer at 19 minutes, okay? Again, my name is Els Begras. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Baruch College. I'm also the moderator / discussant for this panel, panel on federal immigration enforcement and state immigration politics. We have 3 wonderful presentations. I will briefly introduce each presenter right before they come up, also because I'm in charge of the panel here. So we're going to start out with Theo Micah. This is a presentation that he worked on, or a paper that he's working on with Miranda Katie Hallett. They're both from the University of Dayton. Theo is a professor of sociology at Set University, and he teaches and does research on immigrant and refugee integration at local organizing around immigrant rights, right in my topic area. So I'm very happy to have you on this panel. So I'll open the floor to you, and I'll get the presentation slides up. Did you want to do it from there? Wherever you want to. Just stand here. Just make sure you're talking to the mic. Okay.
Good morning. Unfortunately, Professor Hallett can't be here, so it's up to me. So anyway, this is a report on an ongoing project that we've been involved in. It actually started last summer. Basically, the point is to look at what the continuing issues are in terms of refugee and immigrant integration, both institutional and interpersonal. And we've been conducting interviews and doing some field work, getting students involved, because actually students in our classes and another small group have done a lot of the interviews. And one of the things that we did focus on, or have been focusing on, or what are some long-term challenges that immigrants and refugees face, okay? Those have been in Dayton at least 5 years, okay? Because we already did research, or I already coordinated research on the more immediate ones. But I want to focus on one aspect of this research, as we ask questions on what's been the reaction of Trump administration, policies and rhetoric and so forth on immigrant and refugee communities in Dayton. And we have, going back here, what we have interviewed are two different kinds of folks. One is representatives of immigrant and refugee communities themselves, and another are the staff of local human services organizations, some of them nonprofit, a few in terms of government, who work with these populations and thus have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So, so about the Trump administration. This is something that was, I think, maybe one of the most interesting findings, although it doesn't sound really earth-shaking. But the word fear comes up again and again and again. It doesn't matter who's interviewed. It doesn't matter whether they're human services people. It doesn't matter whether they're immigrants and refugees. It doesn't matter how long they've been here. And also, what we found, interestingly enough, is this is across the board, okay? So they're not only found commonly among mixed status, when people are talking about or members of mixed status communities, which are high level of undocumented, but found, for example, at the other extreme in refugee populations where most of the people, well, many of them have already become U.S. citizens, okay? The fears, of course, have different kinds of levels to them, okay? So this is, I've highlighted in red some of the things I wanted to point out. New fears involve traveling, driving, going shopping, and just being outside. In other words, many people express that either themselves or people that they knew did not want to be in public that much for fear. Fear, if they're undocumented, of being picked up by ICE, okay, even though ICE has not been particularly active in Dayton, okay, or simply fear because they're going to be stereotyped, harassed, and so on and so forth, okay. So the last quote there is from an Hiska Turkish interview. And this is a response to Trump's policies of, first of all, suspending refugee resettlement and then targeting those 6 Muslim countries for suspension for a while. Most Turkish refugees are Muslim themselves, and causes anger because we came as refugees too. Very upsetting in the community, okay, though they're not directly affected. One of the interviews with the pastor of a church in Dayton that is located in an area with a decent number of Latino households, and this church has programs for Latinos and their children, so highlighted every single one of our families are at risk. That is from Trump administration policies. And then the next highlighted thing, I wanted to give her an honorary sociology degree for this insight. We create criminals with our laws. These are human rights that people have, and we are taking away from them. Now, it's not just this perceptions, by the way. We're finding tangible impacts that people have been having or perceive being having. So one person mentioned that it seems to be more difficult to find jobs now, okay? And this is, of course, post the Great Recession, where the economy has been bouncing back in Dayton as well, okay? And this is true of people who aren't undocumented. And in an interview with an immigration lawyer, remarked that many undocumented parents are creating guardianship agreements for their children in case they, the parents, are deported. In another interview with another immigration lawyer, she kind of confirmed that she's getting a lot of these cases herself, and also mentioned that many are filling out property guardianship. So who gets their car? Who gets their home? Because many have bought homes. Okay. But it's not just the immigrant population, but it's also their children, the second and 1.5 generation that are impacted as well. We ask specific questions about that. So in one interview, they feel like since they are Mexican, they are looked at as criminal, and there's more of a rejection and more isolated. Feel like they cannot identify with either being American or Mexican because either rejection or rejected or seen as negative. So they're kind of between two worlds argument there. Somebody mentioned, now this was an interview last fall or last summer, so it's before Trump terminated the DACA program, but there was already a lot of anxiety and fear about the future of that program. The DACA recipients were worried that if they were already had the status that it wouldn't be renewed, or they need to apply, then they wouldn't be accepted, and so on and so forth. Okay. So fear came up again. Okay. And so we didn't see much difference between answers pertaining to the immigrants and refugees themselves and their children. This similar kind of reaction. Oops, get the pointer there, okay. This may have what we called a Trump effect on every day. So again, some quotes from the interviews. People felt more verbal rejection of people since the president condoned it, okay? It seems like people in general now have a license to express anti-foreign sentiments. And there were 2 cases of people that are neighbors of the person being interviewed experienced racial slurs and referred to as, quote, dead Muslims that are here to get Social Security and live off the government, end quote, okay? So that kind of animosity been grown, that people have felt the effects of that, okay? So, critical reflections. Now, one of the things, yes, this is about Dayton, Ohio, that medium-sized city in southwest Ohio. But I want to argue that it is not important because it's Dayton per se, although at least one of you in the room got an undergraduate degree there. But also it's a new destination site, okay? That unlike the New Yorks and Chicagos and LAs of our country, the influx of foreign-born in Dayton is a relatively recent phenomenon, beginning really in the 1990s. And so it is kind of typical of cities like ourselves, particularly older industrial cities that have experienced economic hardships with the evaporation of manufacturing jobs, trying to kind of build itself back up. And there's also no particular reason why I would not expect that the same kinds of findings would be found in places that are basically similar to Dayton as well. Okay? So what is this for? What are some, in other words, critical reflections? Okay, and certainly what we found, the suffering that people experience, the fear, anxiety, dread, and so forth, is experienced by immigrant and refugee communities as a whole, and certainly not limited to those who have experienced actually somebody being detained and deported or fear for that. Okay, and the political rhetoric and the discourses that the administration has encouraged can serve as a form of what we can call symbolic violence. Okay, it does prime the context for a violation of the civil and even basic human rights against people that are targeted. And something we haven't found in the interviews yet, but we don't have a question on this per se, because it's a sensitive issue, but Dayton has a sizable proportion of refugees, okay? And as we all know, many have experienced traumatic events in their lives. And I wonder if this is a kind of the fact that there is this fear and anxiety about their futures, the future of their communities, if this may psychologically cause a kind of revisiting of those traumas. Okay? The human rights implication of all of this is that certainly more than only fostering hate crimes, discrimination, and so forth, but there is one implication in terms of shaping the legal the consciousness of immigrants themselves, so that if you're identified as quote, quote, illegal, that becomes a kind of like a master status, and so you think you're a person that really don't have any rights. You're beyond the pale of civil society, in other words, okay? And this is the case, in some research it's found, this is the case of even people with that have green cards or legal permanent residency. And this situation shapes people's interaction with institutions in counterproductive ways. And so what we did find, and what a number of people responded, that people are withdrawn, okay? They're not seeking involvement, for example, in their children's schools, go to events at their children's school, not seeking health care unless they're in dire need, and so on and so forth. So these are individuals, but there may be a spillover in terms of larger community with people feeling they lack basic rights, even using Hannah Arendt's phrase, the right to have rights. So immigrants and refugees may become less likely, or perhaps have become less likely, to do things that would be in their own interests, such as object to unfair treatment, whether it's at work or by landlords or whatever, request landlords to fix unsafe structures and things like that. And I already mentioned participate in events in their schools and contact institutions to obtain services for which they are justified. And in fact, one interviewer mentioned that, it didn't include it in here, but she is a Spanish teacher at a local high school and has a lot of Latino students, and she mentioned a lot of them have stopped coming to school. In other words, they become high school dropouts because of the fear, okay? Whether they initiated that or whether their parents are withholding them, she didn't know, okay? So it's a withdrawal from public life, in other words, this climate has created in ways that have been very counterproductive for the future well-being of individuals, families, and communities. On the other hand, okay, and as we all know, there's been a backlash to the backlash policies, and so social movements, no más, no, not one more. There's been the DACA. Unfortunately, many of these have not had an effect on public policy at present, but DACA movement to sustain and kind of make permanent the DACA program, organizing by people with temporary protected status. Unfortunately, that hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, Trump has eliminated protected status for 4 countries in the last year, okay? But at least this is mobilizing for this. And then in also what we can tell is there is a expanding pro bono work by lawyers to protect immigration rights, okay, or immigrant rights. And one of the interviews with an immigration lawyer said another consequence of the Trump administration is an upsurge in the number of people trying to apply for U.S. citizenship. Immigration lawyers are besieged by cases. And another immigration lawyer and somebody else mentioned that there's a real interest in citizenship, okay? And they want to know the how to do that and how to qualify and so forth, okay? Now, us, academics, researchers, we can contribute to all of this, okay? We can communicate relevant findings, like in conferences like this, in the public media, designing and conducting participatory action, and engaging research on immigrant rights. And in Dayton, and again, it's not so much Dayton, but this is something that I no reason not to suspect that it isn't happening in many other kinds of places similar to Dayton. What is particularly significant about Dayton, in 2011, the Dayton City Commission passed what's called the Welcome Dayton Immigrant Friendly City Initiative. And they set up, and this was on the heels of Arizona's and Alabama and Georgia's very anti-immigrant laws that were passed. And it set up an organization within the city government to work on integration issues and to solve problems and mediate disputes and so on and so forth. And the reaction takes place in Dayton. Of course, many of the interviews are people that live outside of Dayton, but anyway, the city. But it's despite Dayton being known, having a reputation as a welcoming city, these kind of fears and anxieties and stuff happen despite that. And that just illustrates how even though local places are the center of integration and incorporation, they have no impact on the national policies, okay? But in Dayton, okay, nevertheless, okay, several people we interviewed mentioned that, and these are people that are part of ESL classes, they mentioned an upsurge in people wanting to become involved. How can I volunteer? How can can I tutor people and so on and so forth, okay? Local legal organizations have become more active, more involved, okay? They now want to give talks to immigrant refugee groups about their rights to make sure they understand what the Trump administration can do and what it can, more importantly, what it cannot do, okay? The former Welcome Dayton program coordinator, essentially their director, okay, from its inception till she left last fall to join Welcoming America, she commented that people in Dayton in general seem to be more supportive of immigrants and refugees since the election, and So she mentioned some people putting out welcoming signs in their yard, you are welcome here, and so forth. Participating in demonstrations, specific refugee and immigrant communities. She seemed to be more cohesive, willing to help each other out more since the election. And at my own campus, a group of faculty and staff have been working with local organizations called community partners about what we can do to better assist them in meeting their goals. And these are community partners. They may be tutoring programs. They may be doing other kinds of things involving immigrant refugee communities. It may be programs that immigrant refugee community organizations themselves have going. So we've been in current, well, we're still in conversation with them, but some really neat initiatives are growing, are coming out of that. The law school is involved, which of course is a critical actor at this point. It's facilitated in part by my university's Human Rights Center. So thank you for your attention.
Our second presenter is Jackie, and be kind to her, she got very little sleep. And that's because Jackie is not only a PhD student, very close to being done, right? She also
2-3 weeks.
She also works as a policy analyst. She's a PhD student at the New School here in New York City. Started out at UC Berkeley. Go Bears! There's another bear in the room, at least I know. I graduated from UC Berkeley, so a little shout out there. But she also works as a policy analyst for the National Immigration Law Center, which is a national organization that engages in policy analysis, litigation, education, and advocacy to defend and advance the rights and opportunities of immigrants, particularly low-income immigrants. If you haven't checked out their website, you should. They do phenomenal work. Jackie is presenting work that's from her dissertation. It's titled The Utah Compact, 8 Years Later, Does Utah Still Go Blue for Immigrants? Jackie.
Thanks so much. Hello everyone, how's everyone doing? Since I'm at this intersection of doing policy work and research, I'm particularly interested in questions that are useful to advocates as they're doing work on the ground. And so there's a burgeoning literature in political science and sociology around sub-federal immigrant policy making. And ELS is one of the leaders of that burgeoning movement that's been very exciting over the last few years as comprehensive immigration reform on the federal level has really shifted a lot of the action around policy down to the state and local level. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about, situate my work in that field, and then talk about the question of when red states go blue. And then this is actually an expansion of this is the next project after my my original research to kind of figure out next steps. But so just really quickly, why state level undocumented rights? For many years, fields in the field of political science didn't think that you could really talk about immigrant rights on the state and local level because honoring power, that is a constitutional federal matter, and so doesn't actually have any implications for the states. That's clearly been happening for a long time now that we've been doing state and local work, and really by 2010, when the DREAM Act failed, really most immigrant advocacy organizations across this country really began to shift their focus back down to the state and local level. And although the documented youth movement has been doing fantastic work in DC lately, really most folks right now are really focused on what they can do to mitigate the harm at the state and local level. So Karthik Ramakrishnan and Alan Coburn call this sort of the the menu of state level undocumented rights. California is beating everyone else, and as a New Yorker, I find it, I consider myself bi-coastal, but I've spent time in both areas. But as a presently a New Yorker, California is really actually winning all of the battles. And so the kind of menu of undocumented rights that have really emerged over the last few decades are access to higher education for undocumented students, including both in-state tuition and private or public scholarships, healthcare, driver's licenses, professional licenses, right to counsel, enforcement, civil rights, and voting. And so one of the big questions is, how do you explain why California is doing so well, whereas New York, we don't even have driver's licenses for immigrants, we don't have the DREAM Act to give access to, I was the founder of both of those particular coalitions multiple times, so starting in 2001, so it's a personal thing for me. And so there's a question about why state variation, why you have a certain menu of rights in one state and not another. And Cartha Krishnan in particular has sort of been partnering with various collaborators to do a lot of statistical analysis to try and look at how do you explain, New York versus Massachusetts versus California, and they looked at various factors like demographics. Is it places that have more immigrants? Is it places where there's presence or absence of protest? Is it housing overcrowding, economic factors, the state level policy climate? And most of the research convenes around the kind of obvious sort of answer to maybe a layperson who's not doing statistical regressions, which is you have a democratic state, you have democratic laws, and and I think that's kind of been the environment for a long time, and it means that those of us who've been in blue states have an experience of having some success, whereas there are other states where they've actually only gone backwards. So my particular contribution to this literature, I like to call it bringing agency to the party, is that partisanship alone can't explain state variation entirely for a number of reasons. One is Democrats haven't always been the party of immigrant rights. And so there has to be some explanation, and they may not always be, right? I'm not sure they are right now. And so, there's a question of sort of why does the Democratic Party or Republican Party adopt sort of particular immigrant platforms? I look at this also through a historical lens, so I'm also particularly interested in institutions and how things change over history. I'm an APD scholar, and also social movement theory. So think about how actors on the ground are engaging with the territory. So it's not just, these factors. We have X number of Latinos or, API populations in our state. I guess we just have to wait until the population grows, until something changes, right? Bringing back the agency of actors to be able to work within those contexts. So one of the kind of leading, social movement theories where we talk about what different strategies that state level and local level actors are using is framing. Alice talks about that in her book as well. And thinking about how it is that we're framing the campaigns as we're fighting for them. So the literature is very clear that framing matters, that how you talk about these issues is not just superficial, that it actually has an impact, and that there's a lot of variation of frames. So on one hand, you have people who are conservative outlets use the word amnesty, and liberal outlets use the word pathways to citizenship, and no one ever watches each other's other outlets, and so you end up in our echo chambers and where we are today. And the literature shows that really effective restrictionist frames have been the Latino threat. I don't know if people saw on Long Island this year, Jeff Klein put out this flyer that was just young men covered in tattoos, just kind of looking scary and like they were in gangs, and that was just actually his whole campaign. It was vote for Jeff Klein. He didn't even have to explain really what he meant by that. A really powerful kind of language. So criminality, terrorism, law and order, and immigrant rights have been very invested in using episodic frames, right? Which really means telling stories, right? Telling the personal stories. And this is actually taking over the immigrant rights movement right now. I went to about 30 meetings this week about let's do narrative change. That's the new hot thing in philanthropy and in the immigrant rights movement. There's also a lot of polling and interviews that have shown that the most successful frames are child innocence frames, right? So you put the kid, the dreamer, right? And so that's where we get the dreamer. So we moved away from the immigrant worker, and now it's sort of the innocent dreamer who somehow has been dropped from the sky by a stork, with no connection to economic issues or parents or anything like that. In my research, I do institutional mapping. I look at the landscapes of institutions in each state. I do unstructured interviews and some semi-structured interviews with leaders. I do vote analysis, look at public opinion polls. And for this particular talk, I'm going to just talk about some of the content analysis I've done of newspaper coverage to see how actors are framing, how the debates are being framed. This is actually my earlier work, and I'm going to talk about sort of this as a baseline, which is I looked at Utah to understand why Utah had in-state tuition, which they no longer have in the same way, but why was it that they were such an early adopter? Because Utah is very bizarre. It's this red state. They were the first to have driver's licenses. They had in-state tuition. So it's a puzzle, right, from a point of view of political science to understand why. 3 million population in Utah just now, huge increase in one of the new gateway, like Dayton, a big new gateway destination. 1 in 7 Utahns are Latino or Asian, and they vote, so that actually matters. And they're trying to be the new Silicon Slopes, right? They're trying to be the new tech industry. I'm not sure how many of you guys that was the first time you heard that expression. Maybe not. Someday. They've been trying to do that for 10 years. The documented folks in Utah, there's about 81,000. There's some updated numbers. The majority of them are from Mexico and Peru. And the religion piece. So one of the things that I feared when I started doing work on Utah was, well, is it going to be as obvious as I think it's going to be? Is the answer going to be religion? No spoiler alerts, but yes, that's kind of how it worked out. But when people think Utah, they think Church of Latter-day Saints and the Mormons. 55% of Utahns Christians are Mormon. That has a huge impact on politics. And so one of the things that I was trying to explain Utah's blue streak is, should we look at the demographics? Should we look at the economy? Should we look at the framing strategies of actors or the institutions? And in the immigrant rights movement, when we talk about doing work in red states, it's called the Bibles, Badges, and Business approach, right? Those are the 3 institutions. So if in a blue state like New York, you're trying to engage labor, you're trying to engage educational institutions, maybe providers, but in red states, that's typically the approach. So of course, Mormon politics have had huge influence now nationally. Obviously, the role of the LDS Church in Proposition 8 around same-sex marriage in California. And then LDS actually came out for the first time in the statement of the refugee ban, which was very interesting and very unlike them, as I'll explain. So one of the things that explains also the unique role of the LDS Church to refugee populations is a lot of the structures of the church itself. So they go on a lot of missions, and that means they're going overseas a lot, and that means that a lot of them actually fall in love overseas, or they also develop relationships with people from different countries, and that kind of creates a very different type of relationship to international issues than people in other parts of the middle of the country. It's a very global ideology. They have a very strong focus on genealogy. I read so much about genealogy doing this. I had no idea. This was, there's just a very strong, I'm not from the LDS Church myself, but there's a really strong interest in kind of going back to roots and tracing immigrant roots. That's a huge part of the culture. And so that's another reason that kind of helps explain affinity towards immigrant issues. A very strong view of the family, and there's a reason it's called the beehive state, right? It's because there's a really strong free market kind of ideology, sort of a Protestant work ethic that's embedded in Mormonism that has a very particular kind of open borders aspect to it. So I just, this is kind of the map that we have around current states of laws and policies on higher education. There's Utah hanging out over there. Usually it's kind of the outside, and then, Texas actually was the first. You wouldn't know that necessarily, but Rick Perry was the first to do that. Won't go into this too much, but, the big kind of things that happened were there was this big beginning of doing in-state tuition. There were the big immigrant rights marches, and actually around 2009, SB 1070, SB 1070 happened in 2010 in Arizona, and that kind of triggered this whole other there was a wave of restriction that happened. And then the other kind of big piece is DACA, right? When the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program came about, that also really changed the scene in states. So So locating Utah, there's Utah over there. What's Utah doing there, I guess, is some of the questions. So when you look at partisanship in higher education, it's pretty much a very blue field. These are blue states that have passed these different access to higher education for undocumented students. And so, an easy way to do case selection is you look for the red ones. And there's Utah. I don't know why that looks so light there, but Utah is red and has had in 2002 in-state tuition. So the question was why. So I won't get into this too much, but I'm going to talk about my content analysis. So I did an analysis of media coverage of in the Deseret Times and in the Salt Lake Tribune of the arguments that folks that were pro in-state tuition were making and the arguments that folks that were opposed to in-state tuition were making. And as someone who sort of has read the literature, it's not surprising that they all went very deep on the values, because there's also a very big institutional factor of national groups like the Partnership for the New American Economy that actually go into places to provide support, and they're telling people to use personal frames, use values language. So it's really interesting that they kind of went very close to the script for the way that you're that you're trained to do this kind of work when you're talking to the media. The anti-in-state tuition people made really strong economic claims and really strong claims about fairness and citizenship. If you give immigrants access to education, you take away from citizens, law and order, federalism. This is a federal issue, not a state issue. And then I found that there was a lot of coded race language, a lot of "I'm not racist, but," particularly in a lot of the public transcripts. What do you see that's missing here? No church. No trace of the church whatsoever. I could not find a single faith-based argument for this particular policy, and it didn't make any sense. And then it suddenly did make sense, because it's a very deep institution. It became very clear to me from my semi-structured interviews, every single person, I made maybe 150 interviews, and everyone started with, how do you explain Utah's immigration policy? Well, it's the LDS Church. That was the first word out of everyone's mouth. And so what we see here is that the limitations of the methodology of content analysis, right? The LDS Church is very intentionally, perhaps influencing folks outside of the press, but is very much the driving actor behind the scenes, and certainly doesn't want its fingerprints on it. So that it raises tough questions around how do we study this stuff if the main engines are leaving no trace. And then I presented this at the American Political Science Association conference in September, and then of course, as scholars love to do, found someone had published almost the same finding about a different immigrant issue, making the same claims that the LDS Church, it was always very validating because I wasn't right, but there goes that paper. I'm glad that I was right, but I kind of wish I weren't, or that they were wrong or something. So the kind of themes that came out of that again was sort of the centrality of economic arguments, the invisibility of sort of Mormonism in terms of understanding this, but yet that they were still a major player. And there's a lot of really great public opinion polling that looks at, and I'll talk about this a second, around the roles of people's relationships to immigration and the relationship to the LDS Church. And that anti-tuition speakers had a much higher rate of coverage and participation in the media event, which is also sort of interesting. Okay, so content analysis isn't enough, and you need to look beyond content to understand that institutions matter. Also follow the money and look at the influence of external institutions. There was a lot of actually external players that were coming into Utah, and it was important to trace that. And so the question is there any, but Utah's unique. Not other states don't have these levels of LDS Church participation. So why does that matter? So you've discovered this thing about Utah, and it's from a generalizability science principle, it's completely useless. So I wanted to keep digging. So I decided to go fast forward to 2010 to the Utah Compact. How many of you are familiar with the Utah Compact? You ever heard of it? So the Utah Compact has kind of become its own sort of myth in and of itself, which is that it was this event where business leaders and law enforcement came together in 2010 in Utah to make a statement of principles about immigrant rights. And the principles were that they were united in finding federal solutions to the issue of immigration in Utah, that they were committed to actually a strong enforcement component, how many, 2 minutes, okay, and that families were going to be central to the economy and a free society. So what I did, and then the next year, they passed the Utah Compromise, which was basically a copycat of the Arizona Show Me Your Papers bill. It included a guest worker bill, which they knew they had absolutely no legal authority to do, and partnered it with all of these like very, very restrictive immigration measures, and mandatory E-Verify, all kinds of criminalization pieces. And they used to have a driver's card. They actually suddenly, they downgraded the license to a driver privilege card. They started putting all these, restrictions on it. So it's this very complicated thing because is that a success or a failure, right? That becomes the question, right? Many people see it as a great success, and so that's kind of one of the questions. So I wanted to actually look at what influence the Utah Compromise and the Utah Compact had on media coverage and how people were talking about it. So I looked at actually op-eds, letters to the editor, and editorials in both Deseret News and the Salt Lake City Tribune, interestingly enough, they went away. All the people that were arguing for more expansive immigrant rights started actually moving away from all those values languages, and they started basically almost, talking very largely about the economy, which is very interesting. Meanwhile, the restrictionists were primarily talking about it at a rate of almost 70% law and order. Part of me got thinking about that new Yale study that shows that people who are sort of tend to be conservative have like greater fear kind of impulses, and I found that sort of interesting in that concept. So, but then what does this mean about what this did to the conversation, right, in Utah to me? And what it made me realize is, and then faith is in there a little bit, which is, I have some other explanations for. Faith is much less there with the restrictionists, but that the folks that were opposing immigrant rights, were actually largely using law enforcement language. And if you look at the authors, the law enforcement people that were commenting on this actually had the lowest participation of engagement. So, what does that mean? My takeaway from this potentially is that, and then the legislation since 2011, there's 2 different ways you can take it. One is that it's actually been pretty bad. It's actually made things worse. But some people on the ground in Utah say that because they had the compact, it made things a lot, there's been a slight attrition, but they haven't had any major emergencies because that kind of hard enforcement bill sort of stayed off some of the worst things for a while. I guess the question I have is maybe the answer that for the case of Utah that they failed, the expansionist folks failed to engage law enforcement sufficiently. That if you look at coverage and if you look at who was in the coalitions, that the restrictionist folks were really going hard on the law enforcement side, and the expansionist folks were so focused on the economy because that's sort of an ideological preference of theirs that they failed to engage potentially another anchor. So that's my guess, and we'll see, we'll find out in the future. But yeah, so that's my.
Thank you for a great presentation. Get the next slides up. Our next presenter is Hannah. She's an associate professor of sociology at Wake Forest University. I'm glad she's here. She's from North Carolina. If you've been following the news, the area's been hit by tornado, so I'm glad that she's here. She's been working a lot with the community to get organized in response. Hannah's scholarship examines the political origins and consequences of social inequality with a particular focus on immigration and race relations. I've known Hannah for a long time. We overlapped at UC Berkeley, as I mentioned, there's another bear here. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to New York City. So, welcome.
Oh, you got it? Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. It's a particular pleasure to be on this panel. I think you'll notice that there's a lot of overlap across the 3 presentations. We've heard about Ohio, we've heard about Utah. I'm going to take you guys to the South now, and I'm going to start off in North Carolina, which is my home state, and also one of the case studies for this project that I'm currently working on with my collaborator, Jennifer Jones. Last summer, in a medium-sized town in North Carolina, 3 undocumented Latino men were waiting in a parking lot outside a strip mall. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. They were having some coffee, gathering together before they went off for a day's work at their construction jobs. And as they were hanging out and chatting, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by ICE vehicles. ICE had been out in the area looking for someone else. They hadn't been able to find their target, so they apprehended these 3 men instead. Within days, they were all in detention centers out of state. Very shortly thereafter, one of them had already been deported. Now, within a few days of these apprehensions, a couple immigrant rights organizers, all part of the same organization, decided to hold a press conference. At this time, this is last year, as I said, ICE apprehensions were up about 45% in this area. They're now up almost 60% in the same area. And so this organization wanted to draw attention to these apprehensions and to their human toll. This is a photograph from that press conference. They held it in the very same parking lot where the apprehensions happened. And the event was nothing if not dramatic. I won't get into all the details, but there was a lot of media coverage, a lot of folks there, and one of the key speakers at the event was the wife of one of the men who had been apprehended. ICE apprehended her husband just days before she was due to give birth to their second child. And she spoke tearfully into the microphone about what this apprehension meant for her and her family. And as she was speaking, shortly after she finished, one of the attendees turned to an organizer and said, "Why on earth would ICE take somebody who'd been in this country for 10 years, more than 10 years, and whose wife was about to have a baby?" And the organizer's response was, "They took him because he's brown, and so ICE says he doesn't belong here." Now, immigration is a pretty recent phenomenon in the South, in North Carolina, other places in the region. If you go back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, there were not sizable foreign-born or Latino populations in this region, but that's changed dramatically since 1990. And my collaborator and I are studying political responses to this population growth, and one of the things that we found is that this population shift, this growth in particular in the Latino population in the South, has triggered the growth in immigrant-serving organizations across the region. There are more and more organizations that are being set up to serve and represent immigrants, and they're taking an increasingly public role in the region, holding press conferences like this one, doing all sorts of advocacy and lobbying work. And so one of the questions we're asking in our research is, how do these different organizations understand their work? How do they understand immigration? And how do they develop political strategy in new destinations like the South? And to answer that question, we're looking at 4 specific states. We have a little bit of the same case logic as Jackie, where we have some outlier states in here, and then some states that have followed more predictive patterns in terms of politics. And we're using a host of different methods to answer this question. So we have in-depth interviews, ethnographic observations. I really want to give a shout out to some of these organizations. They have been incredibly generous in turning over their archival materials to us. They've just said, here are all of our files for the last 10, 20 years, take what you need. And then we also, I don't have it mentioned here, some content analysis as well. And what we found is that these various organizations have starkly different visions of what it means to support immigrants in the South today and of how immigration fits into the U.S. social and political order. And that story that I opened with, at this press conference in North Carolina, really speaks to the heart of these divisions, and that's race. For the organizers of that event, immigration and immigration enforcement are fundamentally about racism. And that vision is emblematic of what we're calling a color-conscious approach to immigration advocacy. But not all organizations in the region take that approach. Others completely eschew any discussions of race or structural inequality, and they take what, at least for now, we're calling a colorblind approach to immigration advocacy. And so what I want to do with my time today is give you a sense of what these 2 approaches look like, what kind of work these different organizations do, and to show you that these orientations aren't just about the language that advocates use to talk about immigration. They also lead groups to pursue very different strategies and goals, and that these strategies and goals are sometimes at odds with each other and create conflict. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about this colorblind orientation. The colorblind orientation is characterized by a key set of features. So organizations that adopt this vision in their public-facing work typically characterize immigrants as strivers. So they're replicating that long-standing bootstrap narrative that we've all heard about immigrant upward mobility. And when they talk about immigrants today in the South, they compare them primarily to previous generations of immigrants, people who they think have successfully incorporated into U.S. society. Some of the buzzwords for this approach are words like diversity, inclusion, and integration. And this approach really portrays U.S. society and the U.S. political system as fundamentally open to anybody who's willing to strive for inclusion. Now, organizations that adopt this model, that use this model to kind of guide their work, see immigrant incorporation as their main goal. That's what they're working towards, is immigrant incorporation. And they believe that if you can just get more resources for immigrants, and you can do more education among native-born citizens, that you can hasten the incorporation process. And so these groups are usually focusing their efforts on things like service provision to immigrants. They might provide legal services, English language training, healthcare access, that sort of thing. And they focus on hosting public forums. So they'll either be like public education events to tell native-born citizens more about immigration, or these public forums are sometimes award ceremonies to celebrate the achievements of local immigrants. Now, because this approach really emphasizes inclusion and it prioritizes charity and philanthropy over any kind of structural change, organizations that adopt it typically have an easier time attracting donations from mainstream groups than do organizations that take other approaches. So in particular, these organizations are able to attract a lot of donations from resource-rich white communities, from churches, which are major institutions in the South, and also from mainstream corporations and foundations. But recently, these groups have been trying to enter the political fray, particularly since the Trump administration came into office, and they've struggled on that front. They found that they lack the political allies to make substantive political change, and usually when they make requests or make successful political appeals, they're for more symbolic proclamations of support for immigrants that don't necessarily carry a lot of tangible benefits around citizens. So let me give you an example here of an organization that adopts this approach, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama, or HICA. This is a really impressive organization. They were founded in 1999. HICA is the longest-standing, most well-known and well-respected immigrant rights organization in the state of Alabama today. And you can really see this colorblind orientation in HICA's statement of purpose and intent here, where they say, HICA views immigrant incorporation as a dynamic, two-way process in which newcomers and the receiving society work together to build secure, vibrant, and inclusive communities. And this photograph that I have up here is their 2016 annual report, the cover of the annual report, and you can also symbolically see this colorblind orientation in the photograph. You've got a young immigrant woman who's cheerfully waving American flags and showing her enthusiasm for her incorporation journey in the United States. Now, like other colorblind organizations, HICA frames U.S. society and the U.S. political system as fundamentally open and responsive. And they believe or orient their work around the assumption that anti-immigrant tides can be quelled by public education and by public displays of immigrant respectability. So HICA's done a tremendous amount of work in the state, building programs that provide legal services, translation services, healthcare, and other sorts of services to immigrants. And the organization is well known for these regular award ceremonies that they host, where they recognize the achievements of Latino immigrants in the state of Alabama. This colorblind approach, kind of eschewing any discussion of race or structural change and really focusing on immigrant integration, is an approach that donors and white communities have found very appealing in the state of Alabama. Last year alone, HICA brought in $350,000 in individual donations. That's just last year, just individual donations, and that amount is nothing compared to the corporate and foundation bequests that they get. The organization's also bringing in quite a bit of money from Wells Fargo, Alabama Power, and other big corporations. Now, these victories notwithstanding, HICA's really struggled to translate its support, all of the support into effective political action. Most notably, the organization's been criticized quite a bit recently for its failed efforts to anticipate Alabama's HB 56 anti-immigrant bill, and for the fact that it hasn't really been present in the fight to try to contest that bill in the courts or push for more supportive initiatives for immigrants at the state and local level. In general, HICA's found that its mainstream allies have been unwilling to expend their political capital to push for more proactive, pro-immigrant supportive measures. And so to the extent that HICA has won any victories in the political arena, those victories have been symbolic, sort of symbolic proclamations of support for immigrants. So that's the colorblind approach. Let me tell you a little bit more about this color-conscious orientation that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Organizations that take this color-conscious approach use a strikingly different vocabulary when they talk about immigration and immigrants. So these organizations characterize immigrants first and foremost as racialized minorities who are the targets of discrimination. And when they draw comparisons between today's immigrants, this is particularly Latino immigrants in the South, they compare today's Latino immigrants to African Americans. And so where colorblind organizations use buzzwords like diversity and inclusion and incorporation, these color-conscious organizations use keywords like power, inequality, and oppression. And they talk about things like exploitation and racism. Now, unlike their more colorblind counterparts, these color-conscious organizations assume that the American political system is fundamentally unequal, and that it's characterized by power struggles and inequality. And that groups that adopt this orientation see immigrant rights not as so much as being about integration, but as being about contesting structural inequality and structural racism. So as a result, they do some service provision work, but they're more focused on the political side of things. So they do capacity building in local immigrant communities. They work on leadership training and focus on political action. Now, understanding immigration as a racial justice issue closes some doors for these organizations in the South. Many of the resource-rich white institutions that open up their wallets for an organization like HICA want nothing to do with these more color-conscious organizations. They find their work too controversial or too off-putting. That said, however, this color-conscious approach allows these organizations to build other kinds of alliances. So they're building alliances instead with progressive labor movements and labor organizations, with racial justice movements, and in the South, of particular importance, they're building alliances with Black political elites. And that's a pretty strong power base in many southern states. And so what that means is that a lot of times these organizations may not do much service provision work, but they have more political capacity. And so across the South, what we're seeing is that these color-conscious organizations have actually been able to, or in the progress of spearheading, the establishment of pretty vibrant interracial coalitions in support of immigrant rights. And these groups, these coalitions, aren't just advocating for immigrant rights, they're working in labor and worker justice movements as well, and criminal justice reform. So I offered HICA as an example of this colorblind orientation. I'm going to turn to MIRA, the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance, as an example of this more color-conscious approach. On the surface, HICA and MIRA are very similar. They're both 501c3s. They were both established around 1999 and 2000. They're both the largest immigrant-serving organization in their respective states, but that's about where the similarities end. From its inception, MIRA in Mississippi, its work has been intentionally aimed at cultivating Black Latino alliances. And this approach is grounded in the organization's belief that, as organization head Bill Chandler said, there are, quote, power connections between racism faced by African Americans and the treatment of immigrants in the United States today. Given this vision, MIRA does do some service provision work. They do a lot of legal representation and legal counseling for immigrants, but a lot of their work is focused on capacity building and political organizing. And you can really see this color-conscious approach. I absolutely love this poster. MIRA made this poster to celebrate its 10-year anniversary. And what this poster does is show in visual form how the organization understands itself in the broader context of social movements and social justice in the United States today. And so what you can see, what the poster has here is a road that kind of shows the historical antecedents to Mira's work. And that road doesn't start with Ellis Island, it doesn't start with early pro-immigrant movements, it starts with slavery. Those images up at the top are images of slavery, John Brown's raid. As you move down the road closer to the present, you go through the civil rights movement, the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi in the 1960s. And down at the bottom here are the original board members of the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance. Now, mainstream white elites, even on the progressive side in Mississippi, churches, more progressive business leaders, and so on, have occasionally tried to work with Mira. Sometimes they stick it out, but most of the time they find Mira's approach too off-putting, too controversial, and so there aren't kind of lasting alliances on that front. But this color-conscious vision has attracted the support of Mississippi's progressive labor and racial justice organizations, as well as the support of the state's sizable and influential Black Legislative Caucus. So successful has Mira's coalition building work been that Black elected officials in our interviews routinely tell us in Mississippi, as Derek Johnson did, that any legislation in the state that discriminates against Latinos discriminates against African Americans. Together, this Black Latino Alliance has actually successfully in the state of Mississippi defeated 282 anti-immigrant bills since the year 2005. So since 2005, there have been 283 anti-immigrant bills introduced in the state legislature. They've defeated 282 of them. The only one that was passed is actually just a symbolic anti-immigrant bill. It has no teeth, and it's never been enforced in the 10 years now that it's been on the books. Now, about every organization that we've encountered across the region adopts one of these 2 approaches in some form or another. And so I'll conclude today by just offering 2 main points. First, my collaborator and I are both really interested in processes of racial formation. And so I want to emphasize here that both of these approaches, colorblind and color conscious, both racialize immigrants. They both inject race into immigration politics. For the color conscious approach, the use of race is really explicit, right? These are folks who see Blacks and Latinos as collective minorities who share obstacles and fates. For the colorblind approach, the use of race is much more implicit, but it's still present. This philanthropic orientation that these colorblind organizations have crafts a symbolic boundary between the white folks who are sort of in the position of power to give and Latinos who are on the receiving end of the support. And also because that colorblind approach draws so heavily on respectability politics, all these public displays of immigrants, like here are immigrants who are doing valuable work in our community, what those ceremonies and those awards do is to implicitly position Latinos in particular as the quote-unquote good minorities vis-a-vis native-born Blacks. So in both cases, these organizations are working as race makers and projecting a specific vision of the racial order. And we expect that with immigration being increasingly important as an issue in the South, that these visions are likely to have consequences for the future of both immigration and race in the region. And then as a final point, I'll just note that we're seeing across all of these different states increasing conflict between these 2 types of organizations. Up until the Trump administration, these 2 approaches could coexist peacefully within one community. With the urgency and the threat that's come over the last couple of years, coexistence has become much harder. But as these organizations try to work together, particularly when it comes to issues like policing, they're finding that they share neither a common vocabulary nor common strategies and goals. At best, that means there's tension between the groups. At worst, we've seen some groups actively working to undermine each other's efforts. And so usually when we think about immigration politics, we think about the conflict between pro and anti-immigrant forces. But I think it's important that we also keep an eye to these conflicts that are happening between groups on the pro-immigrant side because they're likely to have just as much of an impact on the future of immigration politics, at least in the South. Thanks.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for comments and questions, and like Daniel did this morning, I want to urge you to queue up at the mics if you have questions. Any takers so far? Well, I can start off. I'll just first of all, I want to thank you for 3 really excellent presentations. As a scholar who looks at immigrant rights and the local politics of immigrant integration, I see so many intersections with my own work. So I have lots of questions for you, but I'll limit myself to the best that I can. I see. I'll just throw out 3 quick questions, and I'm going to turn over the mic to the folks on the floor, and then give you guys a chance to respond. First of all, Theo, in my own work, I look at kind of city responses to immigrant integration, kind of municipal institution building. I'm particularly interested also in city immigrant affairs offices, and of course, Dayton and welcoming Dayton have appeared on my radar. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the role of local political leadership, given that Jackie mentioned the importance of partisanship in her presentation, and we've heard a lot about framing. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how local political leaders have kind of framed these issues and what their response is to the quote-unquote Trump effect, right, that you mentioned. Jackie, what a great project. I'm so excited that you're doing this. I have so many questions for you. I know Utah is exceptional in many ways, as you mentioned. If you were to draw out any lessons for, say, the Bible Belt region where Hannah is doing her work, what would that be? And also, I was wondering if you had the opportunity to speak to folks in the LSD church, and I'd love to hear what their strategy was to do the work that they do, right? How come the absence of faith-based framing, and what is their thinking? I'd love to hear more about that. And then also quickly, I was wondering to what extent all of this work, how it impacts your policy-focused work. How have you kind of carried this over to the work that you do at NILC? Hannah, fabulous presentation. As somebody who's done a lot of work on immigrant organizations, you can imagine how excited I am about your work. I just had a question. You kind of present these 2 kinds of camps as dichotomies, and I totally see how that is the case. I was wondering if you come across any kind of instances of successful organizations that successfully bridged these 2 kinds of ways to kind of approach immigrant issues, and if that's not the case, to what extent have there been successful instances of collaboration between organizations that are predominantly following this colorblind approach versus those that are much more color focused or color, what's the word that you used? Color conscious, yeah. So keep that for what it is, and I want to ask the folks on the floor if you could briefly introduce yourself, let us know who you're asking or whom you're directing your question to, and then after one, we'll give you guys a quick opportunity to respond, then we'll go on to the next.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Oh, you have to turn on the mic. Sorry, both. You on your end too. I turned them off to save batteries. No, you have to press it down for a little bit.
The mute button.
It says, it's the one on the, John, it's the one on the left. Why don't you go first then?
Okay. So great presentations. My name is Daniela. I had a question for Jackie. So when you look at the history of same-sex marriage and how it was passed at the federal level, what I'm going to ask. At the federal level, there were certain blue states that passed it, and then eventually it was implemented at the federal level. So I was wondering, and it's a lot more nuanced than I feel like with same-sex marriage, but do you think comprehensive immigration reform will kind of happen in the same way? Or it sounds like from your case that it's going to be the opposite, that the red states are going to pass certain benefits faster than blue states will. It's a big question, but I was just wondering what your thoughts. I have my own opinions, but...
Thank you for my favorite question. The big issue is sort of that, so the big narrative that's coming out of the same-sex marriage movement as the new civil rights movement, because you know the other ones are all done right already, is that they used a strategy of narrative change to use two white women, you know, and marriage, sort of to use the idea that love is love to reframe ideas of sexuality. To actually intentionally move away from masculine presentations because women are seen as less threatening and sexual, to put white women in front of the cameras, and to particularly focus on a strategy of the institution of marriage as liberation, which the LGBTQ movement before, certainly you know, before then was not united on that front, that was the final goal. The problem with the narrative change argument, and it's the same argument that I make in my chapter about California, where they expanded healthcare access to undocumented kids, is there's this idea that when you try and have a narrative change, oh, it was all because they said love is love, or it's because in California they said health for all. But it's not just what people say, it's who is saying it. And the big problem with a lot of the narrative change framing literature is that it doesn't understand institutions. There was so much money of white, cis, rich gay men that was flowing into that. It was also predatory upon years of institutional space building. So if in the social movement literature you think about civil rights as paradigmatic, it was the black churches that created these spaces, and then you had universities where white kids could come down and, you know, do solidarity work. For the LGBTQ movement, it was bathhouses, it was gay bars, it was ACT UP meeting, it was the AIDS crisis, you know, that actually created spaces. And so whatever happened in the late 90s, early 2000s benefited from that structure. So for immigrant rights, the big issue is, you know, there are a lot of NGOs and there's a whole kind of philanthropic section. There's a lot of amazing work that's being done from below, and that's really where the power is coming from. And I don't think that you can look at narrative change, and the big issue that we have, I think the big part that I didn't talk about here is the labor movement has been a lot of the, you know, and non-traditional labor and the fights between mainstream labor and like worker centers, but that there's been money flowing out of there, right? And the problem is now labor is in an existential death match. And so the big, you know, my argument 5 years ago, 20 years ago, when I started writing this dissertation in the 1970s, was that immigrant rights movements had to put pressure on labor to stand up. I'm not sure what you do with that when labor's lying on the ground, but I still am hopeful that it can happen. But so that my answer is institutions. My answer is that you can't look at it's the same point that I make here, but that you can't understand same-sex marriage without looking at the resources and the money and the organizations that were underlying the state-by-state strategy.
Good afternoon. My name is Roger. I wanted to know, and this is for any one of y'all can answer, what impact the recent decision of the Supreme Court in Sessions versus Mariah, where the court ruled that a section of the of the statute that they used to deport individuals is no longer good. And it did assert that individuals who do have a green card, they do have due process right, you know, which is something that both the Obama and Trump administration was trying to take away from individuals. And also, there was another case where a veteran got deported a couple of years ago, you know, from San Diego, California, and he returned illegally and he got deported again, and the ACLU in San Diego got together, and last year they was able to get a pardon from him, and he's a citizen. Now I want to know how that works, you know, if anybody have any idea of how that works, any one of you for it, y'all can ask.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
You could go, our website has a lot of the analysis of those cases, NELC.org, if you want to look up the legal thing. I won't bore everyone with lawyer talk.
Yeah. So NILC is a great resource to disappear behind the pillar, but yeah, to maybe get some answers to your questions. So, but thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Karen Nokrasiewicz. I'm from New York University. Thank you for this great presentation. I have a question to Hannah Brown. It was really interesting to to hear about this division of organizations serving immigrants. I'm working with organizations serving refugees, and I would say that vast majority maybe even consciously represents this race-blind approach, with maybe very rare moments afterwards when some race reflections appears, like, I don't know, after we're sending Khmer refugees to the South Bronx and then seeing that something didn't work well, or Liberians to Staten Island. And I'm thinking, but I guess the rationale that is being used by some organizations that I've been working with is that this is just more efficient. It's easier to collect money, and eventually it's easier to help more people. So, so what is your thought about the potential outcomes of this work of these different organizations within these different paradigms? Thank you.
And if I could just add on to that, how does religion figure in terms of, you know, the Muslim question, so to say? In that, you know,
Right.
given that she's talking about the refugee community, that kind of comes to mind.
Sure. So that's a great question. And I think the decision to adopt either one of these approaches is very much an instrumental strategic decision. And when these organizers are making these choices and establishing their organizations, and you can see these, in these organizational papers, you can really see the evolution of these different visions as organizations are building and forming their boards and deciding what kind of work they're going to do. These are strategic choices that they're making, but they are strategic to different ends. And so I think a lot of times when we, you know, as Jackie mentioned, there are a lot of organizations that have done really interesting work on like what kinds of appeals are most effective, but you always have to ask effective to what end, right? Like, what's your goal? And so if your goal is to get comprehensive immigration reform, then a more colorblind strategy is probably going to work better, because you need to convince all the members of Congress that regardless of their constituencies and regardless of, you know, the areas that they're representing, that they need to support comprehensive immigration reform. And so a more colorblind narrative that focuses on inclusion and diversity and the value of immigrants is more effective in developing the kind of appeal that you need to create in order to get a bill passed through an institution that is predominantly white and affluent and has been for its entire history. That, of course, being Congress. Now, if your goal isn't just immigrant integration, if your goal is really toppling structures of inequality and racism, then the appeals that you are going to use are going to be different, and the language you're going to use is going to be different, and the kinds of coalitions that you want to build are going to be different. And so for these organizations, and keep in mind, this is the South, right? The demographics are different in the South. There is a sizable African-American population in the South. In places like Mississippi, about half the population is African-American. And so you can build a tremendous amount of political power by appealing to African-American voters and elected officials. I'm not sure how these color-conscious appeals would play out, and I mean, you can guess what it might happen in a state like Maine or Vermont that's predominantly white. But in the South, these color-conscious appeals have a long history. They didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like the immigrant rights organizations invented them. They're adapting language and appeals and appealing to institutions and organizations that have been around a long time. And so if your goal, for example, is to get a city to pass a cite and release policy that's going to broadly protect people of color, then it makes sense to use these color-conscious appeals where you can build a broad base of support. And so it's which appeal works best depends on what your purpose is, I guess, is what I want to say. And I'm actually not quite sure what your question is with respect to...
Well, because the question was about refugees, if you think about the current recent media reporting, refugees, tying that to the issues related to Muslims, I was wondering, in some of the places where you've done research, I'm most familiar with Georgia's and I've done work in Atlanta, they have a sizable refugee community. So I was wondering to what extent these two ways of framing the issue does that work when you have a sizable local refugee population, or does that then, is there maybe a third way? And
Right.
so, and that's kind of what, so yeah.
I think it's possible. So remember, this is all still emergent right now. I mean, and like I said, up until Trump was elected, these different approaches, as far as we've been able to discern, could coexist on the ground. And you had the more colorblind organizations doing their service provision work, which across all our different states includes refugee resettlement organizations. I don't think I've seen a single refugee resettlement organization that adopted a more color-conscious approach. But now that threats are so urgent and they are so broad, and as Theo mentioned, it doesn't matter if you're a refugee or a citizen, if you still feel the same sense of threat and sense of fear. I think we're seeing, and I know this is true in North Carolina, emergent efforts to build coalitions across these different organizations, but it's taking an awful lot of work to get there because the groups don't even have the same terminology or language when they're talking about, the threats that these different communities are facing. So I think there may be a third way that's going to emerge, but I think it's too early to tell.
Before we turn the mic over to John, I want to see if Theo wanted to respond to either my question or reflect on what's already been shared.
Okay, well, respond first of all to Hannah, her division between color conscious and color blind. My sympathies are with the color conscious, but I'm practicing the color blind, so I don't know.
I think a lot of people feel torn.
Okay, with respect to Elle's question about local political leadership and how they frame issues and so forth. A couple things very quickly. Welcome Dayton actually emerged not from us unruly folks demanding they do something, but actually from the city itself, from city staff, the City of Dayton's Human Relations Council, after hearing about discrimination against Latinos in housing by landlords and verifying that was a pattern, decided to call all and sundry together to have community conversations about how can we make Dayton a more immigrant-friendly place. They didn't know what that would result in, and after meeting a couple times, we decided that we needed to have a resolution, and we needed to take it before the City Commission. It passed unanimously, widespread support, and so forth. And presently there's a Welcome Dayton committee composed of community representatives that is a kind of consulting oversight. We have different roles. I represent University of Dayton, and the head of that is a Dayton City Commissioner, by the way, who traces his family roots to Lebanon. In terms of framing issues, that's kind of interesting. I'm going to take it to the argument about Welcome Dayton. I knew so many people that engage in the community conversation that resulted in Welcome Dayton and have been working on issues since then. And I don't know anybody who doesn't do it because it's not the right thing to do for humanitarian reasons, whether it's from their faith-based perspective or a secular perspective. And yet, the way the city has framed it for the larger population is it's in our economic best interest, okay? So we need immigrants and refugees here because A, B, and C. First of all, they occupy homes that would otherwise be unoccupied. Their kids keep the number in Dayton Public Schools up. They start small businesses in some areas where they have a lot of businesses closing and so on and so forth. But so, and that has a function, I think, and they're not kind of being insincere about it so much. Because, yeah, they realize it is a big economic benefit for Dayton, but also if somebody speaks out against immigrants and refugees, you could always say, oh, well, you want these folks deported, for example. Oh, you want those houses down the street to be vacant again? Do you want the number of kids in Dayton Public Schools to go down and teachers have to be laid off? And so in terms of presenting in terms of our own self-interest, I think has a very positive function. Okay.
There's 3 more people lined up at the mic, so I'm going to collect these questions in the interest of time, and then you guys can pick and choose among which one you want to answer. So, John.
Excuse me. Hi, John Mollenkoff, CUNY Graduate Center. I think the discussion of framing is fascinating. I'm a little skeptical that either of the pro-immigrant frames convinces a lot of, say, whites who might be from the middle to the right to change their mind about the issue. And I'm curious what you think about the success of the right framing of immigrants as, you know, criminals and welfare freeloaders and law violators, and to what extent that has succeeded in enlarging the base for the Indian immigrant position. Anybody can respond to that.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Elton. Thank you for the conference, and I appreciate all the presentations. My name is Neil Hernandez. I'm a practitioner, and I work with asylum seekers. My question is for Theo. Theo, in your work, can you share how the Trump's policies are affecting asylum seekers or other immigrants seeking immigration benefits? Do you see them having difficulty accessing those benefits and applying for those benefits? Thank you.
And the final question.
Hi, my name is Nick. I'm from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. My question is also to Theo. It's concerning sort of how the spectre of ICE and deportations affects immigrants in Dayton, and also the way in which this creates a culture of unscripted resistance. We're talking a lot about scripted resistance and the way people sort of organize around civil society, but the way individuals sort of respond, maybe adjust the way they travel to work or so on and so forth, and how maybe more ICE raids and more deportations impacts that. And maybe if Jackie or Hannah could speak to that as well in their own.
Great, if you guys could take no more than 2 minutes each to address, that'd be awesome. Who wants to go first?
Sure. So the framing is a great one, John, and I struggle with that a lot. I mean, I think in one reading, and probably the one that I probably believe the most, the framing has been the biggest error of the immigrant rights movement. The moving away from an economic-driven narrative to because there was a cyclical thing that happened where everyone started reading the polls and said, well, we did the polls and we found that innocent kids work. And so they kept on using the innocent kids frame, and then we ended up, you know, and you know, the big fight before was, well, then we're only going to get, the kids are going to get relief. Well, guess what happened? We didn't get either, right? I mean, it still might happen, but I think that, you know, you're right that the problem with the framing of children is it relies upon empathy and not self-interest, right? Whereas the rights frames rely on a theory of fear, the Latino threat narrative, feelings of, you know, criminality. And, you know, the immigrant rights movement was using that, the felons not families was the narrative of the immigrant rights movement until very recently. And, you know, I think we were very much to blame for the what we call crimmigration law, right? The increasing merging of immigration law and crimmigration. I think that amazing work around criminal justice movements, Black Lives Matter right now, has made using that language no longer actually something that even mainstream groups do anymore, but it's kind of like the damage is done. And so I think that we're kind of we were caught basically fighting with the ghost of what basically is a very effective frame, which is the gang member, and all we have is an innocent kid on the other hand, and I don't think that that's strong enough. So I think we need a new one that's a little bit, you know, that brings back economics and brings back self-interest and brings back kind of the bigger thing. But if I knew what the right frame was, I'd probably have that. You know, comprehensive immigration.
Okay, with respect to the question about asylum, we have interviewed a handful of people who actually received asylum, but nobody's actually mentioned the current impact of it on people in Dayton. So I don't quite know what to make of that, except that from the research we can't really say anything yet. Now, we do know, of course, that the Trump administration made getting asylum a lot harder than it used to be. People did mention things about knowing people, or in themselves in one case, of bringing relatives to the United States, and that being far more difficult and being pushed back and so on. Okay, so I'm sorry I can't be more definitive about that. In terms of the impact of ICE in Dayton, ICE hasn't been terribly active in Dayton, although it has been, but I don't think Dayton is anything unusual in this regard. We do have a police chief who has a policy to not ask about immigration status for people who are picked up for minor traffic violations, for example, or for people, especially people who want to report crimes. and he actually argued before Congress against a bill that would kind of mandate asking about immigration status questions. But yes, we have heard that people, in terms of the withdrawal from public life, idea is that people have changed. They shop at fewer places, and it's like you do shopping once and you gather a lot of stuff rather than going more frequently and changing routes, so you're on the road less. So it does definitely have an impact on people's daily routines.
Hannah, you got the final word.
All right, so I'll return to the question about frames and say that for the most part, we don't have very much evidence in our data that either one of these orientations is actually pulling people from an anti-immigrant stance to a pro-immigrant stance. What they're doing is mobilizing different bases of support that were already there and possible to tap into. So for the case of the colorblind orientation, that means these organizations are getting churches to mobilize, to speak to your question about churches. And churches are pitching in lots of different ways. A lot of it is financial. Some of it's also like escorting immigrants. We'll go with this one immigrant who's got a doctor's appointment and they're afraid to go by themselves, or they're afraid, or they can't drive these days, that sort of thing. The one place where I think there really has been evidence of a shift from being more anti-immigrant to pro-immigrant is in places like Mississippi, where black elected officials once kind of by default took an anti-immigrant stance. And then as these color-conscious immigrant rights organizations have been able to say, you see what's happening here, like schools are shutting out non-citizens, or they're requesting documentation status before they're enrolling students. They've been able to draw direct comparisons between that kind of discrimination and the same kind of discrimination that African Americans have long faced in the South around education issues. And so we've had many black elected officials tell us about the process by which they came to understand immigrant rights as a black issue. But as I mentioned, other than that, I think a lot of this really is about using the right words to mobilize people to action rather than getting people to change position.
Well, that concludes this panel. Please join me in thanking the presenters for their wonderful presentation.